Hello, everybody. Welcome to our webinars for the School Climate Transformation Grants for state education agencies. I'm Heather George, and I'm not sure if Tim is able to join us today, but we have an invited presenter of Don Kincaid, also from the University of South Florida, who's going to be talking with us today about how to integrate AWARE, school climate, and PBIS at the district and state levels. As a reminder to you, we are going to be recording this webinar, and once Don is finished presenting, we will turn off the recording session, and then you will all get your microphone privileges so that we can talk to each other. So as a reminder, if some of you have called in on your phone, just please make sure your phone's on mute. Otherwise, we don't want to hear any background conversations. And if you do have some questions or comments that are happening during Don's presentation, please go ahead and type them in the chat box. I'll be facilitating the conversations that we have. And any additional documents that are discussed or that we talk about, they'll be able to be uploaded up on the PBIS.org site, and any accompanying documents will be uploaded there as well. And the handouts for today will be posted on the PBIS.org site. Just as a reminder that as expectations, we'll work on being as clear as possible, and we'll work to shift gears on the webinar based on your questions and responses. We don't have any polls set up for the webinar today, so you're good with that, but please try to avoid multitasking if possible. And we're going to allow everybody to have an opportunity to share. We've got a full 90 minutes today, so we are at a little after 2 o'clock in the afternoon Eastern time, but for some of you, if Hawaii's on, I know it's early in the morning for you guys. And again, this is an opportunity for us to learn from each other, and I look forward to hearing what Don has to say and hearing the conversation from you guys as well. So I am going to formally turn it over to Don. And as you guys know, Don is from the University of South Florida, and the reason I thought he was a great person to invite to this webinar, because he's not only director of the state's AWARE project at the federal level, but he's also co-director of the School Climate Transformation, as well as our state project for PBIS. And so I think he can give some insight of how to straddle, integrate all of these various initiatives within a state. So Don, you are up.
Thank you, Heather. And as Heather asked me to present on this topic, I do want to share that I will be talking about how they should be integrated, and we have not achieved all of that in Florida, or I don't know that it's been achieved anywhere yet. But I will talk about some of the ways it can be integrated, should be integrated. In some ways, we've done some process to address that. And we are talking from our perspective in Florida. We have that advantage of all of these projects, our state PBIS project, our AWARE project, and our school climate project, all flow through the state and then flow through us at University of South Florida. So we kind of have a jump start on integrating those. And even with that advantage, we still struggle with how to integrate and move to look at mental health, social, emotional, behavioral systems within a multi-tiered framework. So we'll talk a little bit about this and get some feedback from you as we begin this. I also see by some of the participants that there are some folks online that may know as much or more about this than I do in terms of integration and particularly the AWARE piece and the mental health piece. So I look forward to your perspectives and feedback. I thought it was necessary, since some of the folks on the line might be familiar with your school climate transformation grants and PBIS activities at in your state or district, to really kind of give an overview of what AWARE is, just very briefly, and what it's supposed to do. It's really looking at that coordination integration of service systems to look at two different components. One of those is youth mental health first aid. That's component 2, and that's basically a training program for staff, families, community members to be able to identify students who have mental health needs. The major component of the process is the integration addressing the mental health needs of children, and looking at cross-organizational multi-tiered framework for mental health. So it's really taking how we saw this transpiring is we saw that we already were looking at multi-tiered systems of support for academics, for behavior, and that this would allow us to begin to expand that MTSS approach to look at including mental health concerns of students and expanding that impact that we're having. Here's a way of kind of looking at that connection between the LEA and SEA Aware and School Climate Transformation grants. This is a simple diagram that goes nowhere near how complicated it really is. But I know that in our state, we have LEA grants that receive funding for Aware. It was for only the youth mental health first aid component, and it lasted for 2 years. At the SEA level, we had 5-year funding for Aware and School Climate. It flowed through the Florida Department of Education. They actually are the leads on that, but we have a large subcontract in both of those grants to make sure that the components of each of those grants is addressed. Within Aware, there is a focus on 3 or maybe more, but generally 3 LEAs that are going to be implementing that integrated system for mental health within the PBIS or behavioral framework. Now, the school climate transformation grants that occur at the state level may target an entire state. Ours targets the entire state. Others may target just certain districts. There are also LEA, school climate transformation grants that you're aware of, that may not have a state component to it, but they have written their own proposal for what they're going to be implementing for a behavioral multi-tiered system of support. You can see how it can get very complicated and who's in charge and who's heading this up and how you're going to work in this. And as you're putting all these resources together, one of the things we're trying to create is a streamlined, effective support system for all students. And one of those foundational pieces is how do we break down barriers between programs. And in a sense, we hope we aren't creating more barriers with LEA components and SEA components and Aware at the state level and Aware at the district level. And how do we make sure they begin working together and collaborating together? And it has not been easy. It's a challenge to continue to do that and make sure that even though we are able to, or trying to coordinate those efforts, it's a challenge to do so. We also have, looking at those programs, they're supposed to have very similar goals, really look at it, coordinated integration of activities to look at school climate, school safety, mental health in a comprehensive manner. They can build that on a foundation of a PBIS or an integrated systems framework approach, and really looking at how do we take these two programs, these two approaches, and making sure they're building on the same foundation. Our goal is not to establish something that lasts for 2 or 3 years until the remaining time of the grant is out, but how do we build a lasting, firm foundation that can be sustainable to improve student outcomes beyond the scope and life of this grant. When we look at Aware, we're really looking at that integration of mental health supports within a multi-tiered system of support. We work with our Florida Department of Education, which already has established a multi-tiered system framework. They've addressed that for behavior and for academics for multiple years. Sometimes we find it's a challenge in terms of a lot of language about that, but it doesn't always translate to practice at a district level or even at a school level. But we want to try to build on that framework for academics and behavior and the partnerships that have been developed there to make sure we're starting to address the mental health concerns within that framework too. So it's developing those relationships to make sure we're providing evidence-based practices within that implementation of multi-tiered framework we've been doing for years. Now, we haven't, in our state, we've already established some of those frameworks for academics and behavior. So our challenge for school climate transformation as well as for Aware was beginning to implement those components within what we already had established. So we already have Tier 1, Tier 2, and Tier 3 behavioral supports in place through our PBIS project. Now it's a question of, okay, how do we replicate or how do we make sure that those are consistent within the Aware program, and how do we make sure that they're informing each other? So when we're doing Tier 1 training now for behavior, we're not just going to look at our behavioral curriculum at Tier 1. We're going to be looking at social emotional development at Tier 1. We're going to be looking at mental health needs of students. And if they're not a combined training, we're at least talking about it at a district level. And we'll talk about some of those district level teaming issues in just a little bit. We also have a shared understanding and aware of expanding our partnerships beyond just a staff that run a grant to include school, family, community, and systems partners. And that's one of the things that I think has expanded considerably in the PBIS world and in the school climate transformation grants, was to begin to look at not just how do we impact schools, but how do we impact families, communities, and all individuals involved within a local system. So there are a lot of partnerships and a lot of feedback and impact and shared problem solving and resourcing within AWARE that we are now kind of embedding within our PBIS approaches. That requires a lot of cross-agency problem solving. So at the state level, the AWARE grant has a state management team attached to it that may have very different functions or look differently in each state. Some of the state management teams are large management teams that actually direct all aspects of the grant. Others serve more as an advisory function. Other states have, in their AWARE grants, have actually developed, already piggybacked on existing mental health teams at the state level, and that they're using their resources to really look at enhancing what's already happening for mental health within that multi-tiered system of support framework. Regardless of how those cross-agency teams look, there's still that commitment to expanding an integrated approach for academics, behavior, and mental health concerns of students. One of the underlying issues for mental health is that data and information sharing. That's an expansion of some of the issues that we have in PBIS and at the school climate level, where we may have self-contained data systems within schools that tell us about students who are getting office discipline referrals and students are being suspended and expelled, and those are kind of data that schools are aware of, districts are aware of, and the state are aware of. We have all those data within available to our state project. But there's that added area within AWARE of combined mental health resources, service providers, Medicaid providers within the community that now have information about students who are receiving counseling or additional therapies or supports. And how do we have systems set up to collect those data? What data are permissible to share? What aren't? What kind of agreements need to be there? So there are a lot of additional steps that AWARE mental health piece brings in that might have been missing from just a simple PBIS approach to support. So that interconnected systems framework is, again, that combination of what we were already doing with multi-tiered systems of support for a PBIS approach. Our school climate transformation grant is basically, in our state, is an enhancement of what we were already doing with PBIS at a multi-tiered system level, and now combining it with mental health supports at that same multi-tiered systems level, giving that an integrated systems framework. And if you want more information about that, certainly look at some of the writings. And I know there's been some presentations on ISF that have been provided to AWARE staff as well as the School Climate Transformation Group. We can see that interconnected systems framework is putting together that same multi-tiered system in place of a Tier 1, prevention for all, Tier 2, early support for a few, and then Tier 3, intensive intervention for even a fewer students. And I think as you look through this, it's a very small graphic, but I think if you look at it, you'll see that PBIS lays that foundation and structure for evidence-based practices which evidence-based mental health practices and interventions fits nicely into. And so it makes sense to say, as we're working with districts and we're working at schools in applying a school climate transformation approach that is a multi-tiered system within that PBIS system approach, that we should be able to integrate the mental health aspects of the AWARE program within what we're currently doing. What we don't want to do is to create another set of silos. We don't want to have mental health operating over here and behavior operating here and social emotional well-being here and academics here. How do we make sure at that school level, at the district level, that we have some collaborative problem-solving teams, leadership teams, and support to make sure that we are understanding how these things are all related to each other. And with that understanding that a student generally does not report with one aspect of that. A student with behavior problems may also have mental health problems, and it may result in academic issues. So those are similar needs. Those are needs that go across multiple systems, and we need to have a systematic approach for addressing those students' needs. Here again is just a couple of main points about how an interconnected systems framework for mental health looks very much like some of the same components that we would have in a PBIS. That's why we're talking about interconnected systems framework being a similar approach. I don't mean to say that. It's not a similar approach. It is a way of describing that integrated approach between a behavioral and a mental health approach. So it's not two different tracks. It's actually integrating those supports. So you're talking about those components across Tier 1 and Tier 2 being a leadership team being critical for that process. That leadership team may be the same school-wide teams that are doing Tier 1, Tier 2, or Tier 3 PBIS within the school. There's also very clear training and supports available that look at supports that are Tier 1 for all students and staff and all community members, those that are for some students, and those that are for individual students, being very similar. There's a prevention approach taken, as well as a desire to support students before needs become intensive and require tremendous resources. It's also about setting up that basic school climate and culture. The school climate not just being an absence of problem behaviors, but a caring, nurturing, supportive school environment that looks at positive behavior as well as academic performance and positive mental health of students. There are also very clear partnerships between schools and communities, and we've been stressing that a lot in school climate transformation and PBIS activities in the last few years, not just with communities, but expanding the collaborations with families. And so that is another way that an interconnected systems framework will look at both families as well as community connections being essential for all three tiers to be effective. And then finally, the final point there is looking at decision-making framework. Teams, what kind of problem solving do teams use? What kind of data do they use to make decisions? And within that interconnected systems framework, are using similar problem solving processes with similar kinds of behavior, similar types of data, from behavioral data to social emotional screeners to other outcome indicators or implementation fidelity indicators that will really allow you to identify, one, have we implemented multi-tiered systems of support across all three tiers? Have we implemented those with fidelity? Are we seeing the kind of changes we want to see within our students, within groups of students, within individual students, or the entire climate of the school? Those are all things that we would be looking at being very similar across that interconnected system framework for looking at behavior, academics, and mental health needs. Our goal with all of this integration of aware activities to school climate to PBIS is to really look at what are the benefits and what are the outcomes that we hope to achieve. One of those is, again, to establish and support that multi-tiered system that will really allow us to have a more systematic and coordinated service delivery across schools and communities. That's breaking down those silos of support to really look at how do we look at that whole child, all of the needs in a coordinated and organized fashion so that we're not duplicating activities, missing critical features or supports for students, and can really address multiple complex needs of students and groups of students within that process. We also want to make sure that we're delivering supports to evidence-based practices. We want to do that early and quickly within that multi-tiered systems framework for both AWARE and the school climate transformation and PBIS projects. I know that many of the projects have identified evidence-based practices that they want to, or trainings they want to provide to school personnel. One of the things that we advocated doing within our AWARE grant that we were, it took us a while to address. We have a coordination and integration plan that had to be approved by SAMHSA for AWARE, but we wanted to very clearly take an approach that we were not going to identify evidence-based practices apart from data. We were committed to the idea that in an integrated systems framework, your data speaks as to what you need to do. So we weren't going to say, we're going to deliver these 4 programs at these 12 schools. If we didn't have the data to support what those 12 schools really needed. So part of what we identified within our ISF approach was to make sure we had a very clear way of identifying the needs of students from screening tools or other sources of data to let us know what behavioral supports need to be put in place, whether it was anti-bullying programs or whether it needed to be mental health types of supports that needed to be put into place. Did we need to have programs to support students that might be have mood disorders or students that had substance abuse issues? We wanted to make sure we were very clear on pulling the data from our schools to guide what we were doing. And I think that's very consistent with what we want to do with any multi-tiered system of support, but certainly what we want to do with PBIS. We also have a goal with this process is, again, to improve the quality of care, improve student outcomes. And those student outcomes can be as broad as graduation, post-secondary outcomes for students. They could be as simple as a second grader who needs to stay in school more often so they have a better chance of academic success. So there may be at the individual student level or across the broad systems level. This is all created by really building on and clarifying the roles, who's doing what, how does this system work, how are we going to operate this integration at a district level and at a state level, but also how do we cultivate those relationships and make sure we're not at cross purposes for what we're trying to do within districts. A challenge we have for some of our integration activities is in some of our districts, they have access to the PBIS project from our state. And so they get that piece. Now, what we have is another district that might have, they may have, be targeted as a district that's also supported under the AWARE grant, and another one that has its own school climate transformation grant. Some of our districts have all of those. They already have access to our PBIS project and have been working with us for years. And they got funding for a school climate transformation grant that expands what they can be doing for PBIS. And they are one of the districts that receives funding and ongoing technical assistance in our AWARE grant. So they have tremendous resources and support available to them. It's a challenge, I think, to them to begin to coordinate and organize all of those supports. And that has taken some time. While as other districts may only have access to one component of that. They may have access to the statewide PBIS project. Our goal is to make sure that we begin integrating everything we learn from AWARE and everything we learn from the school climate transformation grants, such as we're targeting in Florida disproportionality issues, early childhood intervention. I think we may be looking at juvenile justice within the future. So we're trying to take all of those components and making sure they start to enhance the support that we're able to provide to the other 67 school districts in Florida. And so that's the challenge we have of that integration, is that we don't want AWARE just to work with 2 or 3 districts. We want to learn from what's happening in those districts about integration and making sure we're using it to enhance the training and technical assistance we're providing to all other districts. There also is that need for cross-system leadership and training. We see that there will be training, and we have had training that looks at an integration of mental health and school-wide PBIS, as an example. Or there may be situations where we see that a district has a mental health team for AWARE and a PBIS team and then a school climate team, and we want to try to integrate those activities to have some cross-system leadership. We don't want them operating separately. In some of our districts, they actually have the same personnel doing all of those, so it makes sense for them to be in an integrated team. We want to, again, utilize our AWARE activities, our school climate transformation activities, to inform and enhance what we are already doing in our PBIS project. It's our goal, at least we hope we continue to get funding from the state of Florida for our PBIS activities. We know that AWARE will go away in 3 years. We know that school climate will go away in 3 years. Our question will be is, what have we learned from that? What have we developed from those approaches that can enhance our work for behavior, mental health integration at the district level? That's our goal, is to try to make sure those things happen. We also want to make sure that we're looking at, in terms of ISF and our AWARE project, looking at the fact that accessing services in schools to become less stigmatizing, that there is a commitment and a realization that we have to address mental health issues. And that's a challenge. And that's one of the challenges we run into in a multi-tiered system of support. We have no problems at all with schools understanding that there needs to be multi-tiered systems of support for academics. They even understand there's a reason for a multi-tiered system of support for behavior, but they're not sure about how do we get consent from families and how do we work at tier 2 and tier 3 to really get folks to buy into this and really want to do this. And then the mental health piece even requires more because of those stigmatizing and some of our emotional or inappropriate responses to mental health needs of students or to communities, where we don't want to talk about this, or we've never talked about it, or that's not my job. So we're having to break down some of those cultural and systems variables to really begin to address mental health more effectively and efficiently within a multi-tiered system. We also have a desire within what we're doing with school climate transformation, PBIS, and our AWARE projects to look at equity and access to supports and services. AWARE is not intended to initially work with every district. It's really working with a few districts to understand how to integrate mental health services within a PBIS framework. But we want to make sure that we address those equity issues within those districts so we can enhance our capacity to do that across all Florida school districts. But within school climate transformation, we're looking very closely at issues around restraint and seclusion, disproportionate discipline, any other those aspects of our students receiving the same or similar or fair supports across our state. And we want to make sure that those same issues are addressed within mental health as they are for behavioral and academic concerns. And finally, it's those developing the teaming structures at the school level, at the district level, that really, as I mentioned before, don't operate within silos, but there is a clear, it may be a consistent team that looks at everything, or there are sub-teams that are able to integrate much quicker and communicate much better than we have in the past, what's happening in each district. And that's what we try to do with our school climate transformation and PBIS work. We really are looking at that cross-system, multi-tiered system of support. Can we have teaming structures that really go across all three projects or approaches? I call them projects because they're funded grants, even though school climate transformation and PBIS are kind of brother and sister in terms of being very similar, and AWARE is really coming into that family as part of our combined total approach for supporting students. What data do we need? And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. How do we make decisions? How do we develop a coaching and professional development approach at a state and district level so that we're not overwhelming districts and schools with so much professional development and and need for professional development, but they don't have the time and capacity to do that. It's one of the questions that was asked a while back at a meeting was, what if schools tell us they want to do school-wide positive behavior support and integrate it with mental health training, and they'd like to do it in 30 minutes? It's going to be hard to do that. It's hard to develop an evidence-based practice and present it in 30 minutes within a school. So that's part of why we have to have that integrated approach, is how do we make the trainings to be concise, targeted, and effective. We are not likely to get schools and districts that are able to do multiple levels of training to address very divergent approaches and try to integrate them individually. We need to integrate those for schools so that there's less work on their part and more fluidity in their application. Again, we're looking at student well-being, behavioral problems decreasing, academic success, and fewer mental health problems, as well as positive outcomes, student efficacy or student positive psychology types of thing, positive statements they make about themselves. And a final way that I think AWARE is beginning to impact some of our work with school climate transformation and PBIS is really trying to emphasize that youth and family voice piece. And I think that was not considered as much in the early years of PBIS as it has been in the last few years, to make sure we've got family engagement and student voice in the process. And I think AWARE took that to another level, that the real need for our school teams to have representation and support, and finding ways to integrate and engage families and students in the processes that we have. So I know this is very small print, but I hope you can see it well. I'll try to go over a little bit. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how AWARE and the school climate transformation and PBIS are similar. And then we're probably going to have quite a bit of time for folks to share ideas or questions as we go. But how we see this happening within our state is that we have a process for our PBIS process. We require each district we work with to have a district coordinator. It doesn't have to be a full-time position. It can be a school psychologist. It can be, in some districts, it might be the special education director. But it's somebody who's going to have that title, because that's the person we're going to be working through as we provide multi-tiered support in a PBIS model. Similarly, we find most of our school climate transformation recipients have a project manager, and that may be the same person who was also the district coordinator if they have PBIS activities within their district. So that may be a shared responsibility. We also have other districts that also have the AWARE components, and they have a project manager and are required to have a project manager for the SEA aspect of AWARE. They're required to have that at the district level. So in some districts, they will have a person that operates as their district coordinator for PBIS, their school climate transformation manager, and their PBIS project manager. And their AWARE project manager. So they've really got roles across all three. While that's great for integrating the approaches to make sure there's consistency, it is very challenging because it's a consuming role. It's very difficult to manage that much, to have that much on your plate. The district coordinators we were working with in one district already had 50 or 60 schools they were supporting. Now they've got to be the school climate transformation manager, and now they've also got to manage AWARE. We're finding a lot of turnover in those positions. So one of the keys, I think, to integrating these is to realize you've got to have sufficient FTE, and you may need to have multiple people in those positions. In some of our larger districts, we actually have multiple district coordinators because one person simply cannot do all that job. And if you had one person and then you added in additional commitments through school climate transformation and AWARE, it would be overwhelming. So we have to begin to look at those things for integrating those three projects. We also have a requirement for district leadership team, or in Florida, we call it a district implementation team for AWARE. And there's generally an overlap there. Sometimes it's the same team operating at the district level. And they may deal with AWARE and PBIS and school climate activities together in the same meeting. In other districts, they are slightly different. teams that may have an overlap or a shared personnel between each team. The PBIS also looks at developing leadership teams at the school, and in school climate transformation or aware activities, there are those similar teams. And for aware, we find that most often those teams at the school level were also their existing PBIS team. Almost every team that's involved in aware through our districts had already been identified as a PBIS school, or were doing some variation of PBIS. They may not have worked directly with the Florida PBIS project, but they were doing something that was already addressing a multi-tiered framework for behavior within their schools, some evidence-based practice that was appearing to be effective. So that team may be already in existence, and now they are also embedding the aware or mental health components. We're trying not to have, again, a parallel team. We don't want to have a team that's looking at mental health, a team that's looking at behavior, and a team that's looking at academics within the school. We really want to try to have that integrated team, but we also know each team is, each school and district may need to organize themselves differently. One of the things that we can share is we don't have any clear data telling us one way of organizing is better than others. The question is, are you organized to produce good outcomes for your students? And if the organization is multiple teams that work, that's great. If it's one team that gets things done, that's fantastic. But we don't really have the data telling us you must be organized one way to be effective. We do have an approach for school climate transformation, PBIS, and aware that really is a systems coaching approach. We're very familiar with that within PBIS world, that each of our schools has a coach that might be a district level personnel, or it might be a school-based person, or multiple people that provide support to that school leadership team and the school leadership to implement PBIS. And there's also coaching to the district leadership team to implement. In Florida, that coaching at the district level is provided by our aware staff for the aware project and by the PBIS staff for the PBIS project. But we're fortunate that some of that coaching can be consistently done by the same staff, because we have staff that are on aware and staff that are on the PBIS project. So one of our most successful districts in the state of Florida has a half-time coach, district level coach, that works on PBIS and half-time works on aware, but she doesn't work half-time on either one. She's working 100% to produce an integrated school climate transformation, PBIS, and aware grant in that district. So she's doing that. She's integrating that systems framework as a full-time position. Now, we also have, in many of our districts that have PBIS coaches, they add additional coaches to support aware, because the aware activities are new and they may come in with some different backgrounds. For instance, the school PBIS coach may have been somebody that was an administrator or teacher that had really learned PBIS from ground zero and really went from 0 to 60 in 2 years and knew how to facilitate the team and make it work. Well, they may not know about mental health concerns. They may not know about mental health processes. So many districts have begun to integrate their process by also providing additional coaching where those coaches might have a mental health background. They may be school counselors or social workers that can bring some evidence-based practice. Maybe school psychologists can address mental health concerns of students. So there may be multiple coaches or enhanced coaching in some of those districts. All of our systems have to address the issue of data systems to support decision making. We have that support within PBIS, and school climate transformations extended that. For instance, within Florida, within our PBIS system, we gather information about office discipline referrals, in-school suspensions, out-of-school suspensions, as well as implementation fidelity of of PBIS within schools. Now, school climate transformation may take that further as we begin to use those funds and begin to target specific needs around equity or around expansion to classroom impacts or looking at restraint and seclusion, some of the things that our school climate transformation was built to address. At the same time, AWARE also is looking at student outcomes, but they may be looking at different kinds of student outcomes. Not that office discipline referrals and in-school suspensions and out-of-school suspensions aren't important, but they may be looking at screening data that tell us the number and types of students that might have mental health concerns at a Tier 2 level. Or they might want to know students that are referred for counseling and support. How many are referred? What kind of access do they receive? How quickly is it received? And what are the outcomes they have from therapy or from consultation? What kind of data do we have looking at those performance targets and performance outcomes for students? So there are different types of data being added in by the AWARE components, but it's not inconsistent with what's already being identified. It's simply an expansion of what PBIS is already doing. And then finally, I think on this page, one of the critical things is to look at that we're really trying to integrate training and technical assistance and tiered implementation. So when AWARE is trying to integrate with what we're doing, we're trying to look at PBIS training for implementation of Tier 1 behavioral support systems. We also want to make sure that we're clearly addressing and supporting schools to address the needs of all students to look at mental health, positive mental health, as well as to begin to identify students that may need additional mental health supports. We also look at our similarities between our projects and the integration of those is to look at the fidelity of implementation. As I said before, we collect fidelity implementation from all schools in Florida that are engaged with us in the PBIS project. And we're also looking at the same sets of data within AWARE. We're also looking at benchmarks of quality and the TFI as measures within AWARE, but we're also looking at some other further integrated systems framework measures that would allow us to determine the implementation fidelity of the AWARE or mental health components of what we're doing. So this may require us, the integration in an integrated system framework might require us to consider different tools for measuring fidelity, as well as different measures for student progress that we hadn't considered before. And so that's part of that integration that we need to do, is expanding the tools we might use to assess fidelity, as well as the measures we may use to assess student progress. We also look at those students that are being successful at Tiers 1, 2, and 3 within a PBIS framework, and we do the same thing within AWARE. But again, what we're tracking and how we're tracking it may differ a little bit. The performance targets at Tier 2 and Tier 3 may be different in AWARE. SAMHSA in AWARE is concerned about the number of referrals for school-based and community mental health supports. But we've tried to take it a little further and said, you know, the number of referrals is a good number to look at, but it's not that important. I just go ahead and say that it's not that important. If we're referring a lot of students, but none of the services are actually effective, then we've wasted a lot of time and energy. If we've not referred a lot of students, and we could refer more, but the services are effective, then we've not done enough. So we want to expand with AWARE that measurement of not just the Tier 1, 2, and 3 outcomes for students at the PBIS level, but also expand outcomes for students with mental health needs by looking at referrals, outcomes of referrals, the improvement of students at Tier 1 that are reporting positive social emotional growth. All of those kind of things are things that we want to try to get a better handle on, and really expands our data system for Tier 1 and Tier 2 and Tier 3 of a PBIS system. The next to the last thing I have here is a commitment to this concept of family engagement, and understanding that family and community engagement is something that is we haven't expanded as well as we need to in PBIS. We're starting to understand how to do that. We're starting to understand how to engage families better, particularly families that may come from very diverse backgrounds and communities. But it is something that is at the front of the mental health issues of AWARE. So it's certainly an area where there can be some very clear collaborations and integration to really figure out how do we make sure that families and youth are trained together, that we can address focus groups. We have utilized focus group approaches with families to talk about mental health, to talk about PBIS related activities such as their Tier 1 implementation program, and also to talk about disproportionality in terms of equity of discipline within their schools, which is something we're addressing in school climate transformation. So there certainly is an opportunity to have things like family and youth teaming and training and focus groups, and that really look at broader issues than simply saying, we want to ask your opinion about this. We might be able to look at gathering opinion and feedback and leadership from families about what they want to see in their schools by really addressing behavior and academics and mental health issues together. We also want to expand the involvement of community partners and families in problem-solving teams. That's one very important aspect of the AWARE grant, is that they want to see community partners involved in problem solving. So it's not just school-based teams that talk about what are we going to do as a school to address the needs of Johnny, or what are we going to do at this district to address the needs of our students with mental health needs, but how do they expand that leadership team to include critical community partners who may be providing counseling or support or family intervention, so that they can be help inform, but also expand the services that are being provided. And I think the final thing here that we see, that integration between AWARE and school climate and PBIS, is really looking at how do we make sure we have evidence-based practices, how do we make sure we're using data to make decisions about the application of those practices, and then how do we make sure that those practices are being done in a way that promotes equity and access, so that we are not showing disproportionate outcomes from students who are being suspended or expelled, or students who are or are not receiving mental health services, or students that may be under or over-identified for those services, because we really haven't dealt with and addressed diversity, culture, as well as most effective practice implementation. So those are all things that are part of what we've been trying to do to integrate. Now, I will share before we move to the question and answer that it has not been always easy. It is an ongoing challenge to move districts and school level teams that are used to functioning a certain way. You'd think it'd be easier to say, we've got a district that's already doing PBIS and there's so many connection points to AWARE, it ought to be easy just to integrate that right in there. It hasn't always gone that way. In some of our districts, they've struggled with the idea of establishing a PBIS system, and they didn't really have some of those pieces in place. So they're starting from the ground level up to establish all that system together that we've just described. Other districts had individual pieces together and separately, and now they're adding in AWARE, and they're trying to organize those, and integrate those. Other districts are struggle with the idea of really a mental health system that looks at all students, and really looking at a clearer understanding of a multi-tiered system for behavior and for mental health, and are really may not have that vision yet of an AWARE approach that is a multi-tiered system of support, and don't see it as we've got school counselors that can provide counseling within schools. That's an aspect of what might be delivered as an evidence-based practice within AWARE, but it is not what AWARE is trying to produce. trying to produce a multi-tiered framework that prevents and provides equitable and easy and effective access to mental health supports within that MTSS framework, which is exactly what we're trying to do with the PBIS approach. So I've rattled on for 45 or so minutes, and I hope there's some questions.